Yeah. So, just kind of on the heels of that party at the Palace that Oklahoma had last weekend, we'd mentioned in the recruiting update that you had mentioned Colton Vasek has committed to Oklahoma on Monday, and so I think the thing about that is really interesting is something that Oklahoma hasn't been able to do. So this kid is a Texas legacy. His mom and dad have went to the University of Texas. He goes to Austin Westlake, which is just right on the back door of the University of Texas. And he was a guy that Oklahoma was in on, but there Oklahoma looked to be on the outside looking in before this visit last weekend, and then went on the visit and committed 2 days later. So I think, I think it's just telling how good the staff has been thus far early on from a recruiting standpoint. So, and just some of the other guys I'd mentioned, Oklahoma has there's three commitment dates, so to speak, within the month of August. One is kind of unconfirmed, but it's going to happen at some point in August. So the two, so Jacoby Johnson, four-star athlete out of the state of Oklahoma, Mustang, Oklahoma, has set his commitment date for August 13th. So a week from tomorrow. I still like everything you hear from that. He was at the recruiting week, the recruiting party this weekend. Everything went really, really well with him. I still think Oklahoma is firmly entrenched in the driver's seat for him. Makari Vickers there was some rumors that he might be moving his commitment date up a little bit. Those have since been made false by Makari himself. So he's still making his announcement on August 26th. There as a high school there in Tallahassee, Florida. So again, this is another kid that Oklahoma is going and getting just outside. Certainly, Florida State's a little bit down comparatively to where they have been in the past, but again, in another school's backyard, going and getting him. So and Florida State's really not in the mix. It's Oklahoma and Alabama. Oklahoma has increasingly made just an incredible imprint on Makari and just kind of where he wants to be. I would say really, really good. Probably a few weeks ago, I would say this was more of a 50-50, maybe a slight lean towards Oklahoma. I would probably say 90% right now. Oklahoma, tons of predictions and silver ball are crystal balls going to Oklahoma. Wide receiver perspective, Anthony Evans he's the guy that I've heard August, not necessarily a date in August, but I don't know exactly, when that will be. And then there's a few others that there's not necessarily a date, but obviously to keep your eye on if you're Oklahoma fans. And I think right here, Peyton Bowen is one. I think he's a guy that's committed to Notre Dame right now. Oklahoma and A&M are in the mix. I think the least likely scenario of the three is him to stay committed to Notre Dame. I think it's probably, from everything I've heard, it's an OU and A&M battle. And he has a younger brother, Eli Bowen, who Oklahoma and A&M are also recruiting. I think he's a 2024 kid or 25, one of the two. But both Oklahoma and A&M are recruiting him. And so I think I've talked about this a lot. He's a guy that's been to Norman 8 or 9 times. So he's been to Norman a significantly more amount of times than he has been at A&M. But I think what's happening now, as you would expect to a certain degree, I think he really, really likes Oklahoma. I think his parents like Oklahoma. But A&M's getting involved now, and when A&M is getting involved in a recruiting battle, there's tons of NIL money being thrown. So I don't know, I don't know if that's going to be. At this point, it's probably 50-50 either way. But I do think he's going to make a decision here pretty soon. All signs point to indicate he really wants to have this behind him and focus on his senior year by when school starts, or certainly if by by their first game from a high school perspective. So I wouldn't expect this to last more than another couple of weeks, but again, I think there's probably a little bit more that he likes from the Oklahoma staff. But again, for these kids, if if you've got another place and they're throwing, and I'm not saying this is what's being thrown, but if they're throwing, you know, 6 figures, 7 figures at you, it's hard to say no. So he's one of those guys that I think we'll find out here pretty soon. Ryan Yates is another kid that's committed to LSU. I think there's probably a really good chance that he lands at Oklahoma. Just hasn't pulled the trigger just yet. He was very, very impressed. I think there's unconfirmed 5 to 6 what I would call silent commitments out of that weekend, and so I think signs indicate that perhaps he might be one of them um, as well. And then a couple of other guys that are down the line in terms of commitment dates, but aren't uh, maybe not necessarily signing day, but aren't going to happen within the next couple of months. So Jordan Raynaud, 4-star defensive lineman, again between Oklahoma and Alabama. Oklahoma has made significant headway in this battle. It looked like maybe it was a slight lean towards Alabama. I think from things that I've heard, it's pretty solid Oklahoma right now. So if Oklahoma continues that relationship and it builds really well, then I think what you're looking at is him coming to Oklahoma, which I think is just big in the general scheme of things. So if those two things were to happen with Jordan Raynaud and Makari Vickers, that's 2 head-to-head battles, Oklahoma against Alabama, that Oklahoma's won. I mean, Alabama's not hurting. I mean, they've jumped all the way up to the #1 recruiting class in the country, right? They've got a couple of 5 stars last week, but at the same time, when you're going head to head on some of these battles and you're able to win a couple of them, I mean, that's an incredible sign on the defensive side of the ball, especially. And then, obviously the guy that a lot of people like to talk about was DJ Hicks. I think, and we talked about this before the weekend. I think it was really Oklahoma and A&M are the 2 biggest players here. There's some other teams that are in the mix, but I think Oklahoma and A&M lead. And I said I would probably give Oklahoma a very slight lead before this weekend. Now I think it's fairly sizable. Todd Bates and Brent Venables have had a long-standing relationship with DJ and his family going back to when they were at Clemson. They were recruiting him. So I think the culture and I think the relationship is very advanced with Hicks and Oklahoma. So that's the one. Like I said, it's still going to be in the long run. However, I have heard that there's a chance that he may not be necessarily a signing day commit announcement. He could be a kid that moves his commitment date up a little bit. And the reason I say that is I think him and the family are starting to get a little bit tiresome of the recruiting process and all that kind of goes along with that. Mark, I think when he trimmed his list down to 5 or 6, I think his thoughts was, and the family's thought was, okay, I trimmed these down, and then maybe there's not as many phone calls and text and things like that. But they said it's been questionably more since that. So I think it's taking a toll, and as you would expect with a kid, as good as that #1 defensive lineman in the country. Certainly he's had coaches and and people recruiting him for the last 4 or 5 years, obviously. So at least the last 3 or 4. And so I think with him, he's another guy that you like where you're at if that relationship continues to go the way it goes, and if it is, this is probably the best defensive commitment that Oklahoma has gotten since Gerald McCoy. Maybe Tommy Harris, but both of those are. But when you look at Gerald McCoy, 5-star kid, top 5 NFL draft pick. I mean that's that's not too bad. And I think so with him. And then the other one that I'll mention is Malachi Coleman. He is a 4-star athlete, probably more of a wide receiver / tight end. 6'5", 185, and this one's really interesting. Again, he's a kid that is right in Nebraska's backyard. Lincoln, Nebraska kid. He's a kid that's adopted, and both of his parents are incredibly big Nebraska supporters. And so, but again, it kind of begs the question: okay, if he's right in Nebraska's backyard, but he's not committed yet. He's got several crystal balls to Nebraska, but he's not committed yet. However, he has over the last couple of weeks, he has been very, very pro Oklahoma, like sharing a lot of these commitment tweets and asking, is this the place that he should go? And so Oklahoma was finally able to actually get an official visit. I think it'll probably be in the September timeframe, early on during one of the games early in September. So he's a guy that's going to make his announcement, I believe, mid-October. He's already set that announcement date at some point in the October timeframe. So he's a guy that Oklahoma's making tons of headway on. And if Oklahoma was able to pull him out of Nebraska's backyard, I mean, maybe not the same as Texas, but still, Lincoln, Nebraska kid, even though Nebraska's not what they have been in the past, you still think that he's, that they would have that area locked down, so to speak. So, I mean, just getting an official visit, I think is big for Oklahoma. But there's about 7 or 8 kids that I've mentioned here, and Oklahoma has 19 signed already to the class. And everything that I've heard, they're probably in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 guys that they're going to take. They don't necessarily want to rely on the transfer portal as much, or certainly not to the degree that they did this year. So, yeah, a lot of good things. Oklahoma's still at number 6 overall. I think when you forecast this forward, I think this has the opportunity, if they get some of these kids, especially Hicks, to be a top 3 or 4 class. But I think certainly no less than top 10 when all said and done.